literature, Black history. This is Jason Williams, and tonight we're going to continue with the story Home in the book called The Ways of White Folks by Langston Hughes. You should buy this book, it's a very good book. And there's a couple of discussions that we're going to have today. One is a political discussion that is portrayed in this book. The next one is going to be the arts, which is portrayed in this book. Now, before we get into that, there are three elements that you should always consider when you're reading any type of literature or listening to any type of message that is being transmitted. You should always consider the author, the message that's being transmitted, and the targeted audience. Again, that is the author, the message being transmitted, and the targeted audience. And you want to make sure that all three of those elements have integrity. And understanding those three elements will also help you understand what it is that you're reading and what you want to accomplish as you're reading a message or listening to a message. Now, Langston Hughes is the author of The Ways of White Folks, and in his stories, he is demonstrating elements and experiences in his own life that he wants to transmit to the U.S. and everyone so that we can understand what was really going on during the time period in which he was alive. And Langston Hughes is a poet, so when we're reading his material, you need to understand that if you're not going to see, quote, grammar, like the correct grammar being written in all of his sentence structures. He is a poet, he is an artist, and you are going to see poetic elements, artistic elements portrayed in his writing so he can emphasize what it is that he wants to get across. Now, politics. Langston Hughes himself never declared his political affiliations, but in reading his literature and reading the literatures of those with who he ran with at the time, you can see that there's a lot of communist and socialist elements in his work and in his political views and the subject matter that he discussed. Now, during times of Great Depression, especially back during the Great Depression, political affiliations and capitalism is always questioned. Back in that time, there were many people in the U.S. who were card-carrying communists and card-carrying socialists. And this should not be surprising to us because during our time, in 2012 or 2008, when the economy fell and Obama was elected and he did his 8 years in office, and still the economy is still struggling, who rose to the forefront that the younger generation were supporting? Bernie Sanders. And what was Bernie Sanders? You know, his platform was very much democratic socialism. Those are kind of scary words to those of us who grew up during the Cold War and stuff with Russia, but whenever there's a time of economic decline and when a country is struggling, people are going to start looking at the distribution of wealth. And, you know, here in the U.S., we keep talking about the 1% and the 99%, the 1% and the 99%. Yes, the distribution of wealth is always questioned. And for those who are struggling and for those who are not benefiting from the capitalist structure, they do start to support socialism and communism in theory. You know, in practice, it's another thing because we have seen that communism in practice may not always work. And however, elements of socialism in government are in favor by a lot of people. And we see that in this story. Roy Williams, when the story begins, after the very introduction, it goes back to what he was witnessing in Europe during the time of the Great Depression. And he talks about the suffering of the majority of the people, and then he talks about how the few or just enjoying themselves, you know, like nothing was happening. Let me read you a passage from the time that he is in Europe, Roy Williams is in Europe, gets sick, and then when he lands in the U.S. Okay, for page 34. Folks catch hell in Europe, Roy thought. I never saw people as hungry as this, not even Negroes at home. But it was even worse when the orchestra moved back to Berlin. Behind the apparent solidity of that great city, behind doors where tourists never passed, hunger and pain were beyond understanding, and the police were beating people who protested or stole or begged. Yet in the cabaret where Roy played, crowds of folks still spent good gold. They laughed and danced every night and didn't give a damn about the children sleeping in doorways outside or the men who built houses of packing boxes, or the women who walked the streets to pick up trade. It was in Berlin that the sadness weighed most heavily on Roy, and it was there that he began to cough. One night in Prague, he had a hemorrhage. When he got to Paris, his girlfriend took care of him, and he got better. But he had all the time from then on that feeling he was going to die. The cough stayed, and the sadness. So he came home to see his mother. He landed in New York on the day that Hoover drove the veterans out of Washington. He stayed a couple of days in Harlem. Most of his old friends there were musicians, actors, were hungry and out of work. When they saw Roy dressed so well, they asked him for money. And at night, women whispered in the streets, "Come here, baby. I want to see you, darling." Rotten everywhere, Roy thought. I want to go home. So I wanted you to pay particular attention to, said he landed home in New York on the day that Hoover drove the veterans out of Washington. This is Langston Hughes setting the tone of the story. One of the occupations of Langston Hughes during his lifetime was a news reporter. He was very involved in politics. He was very involved in what was going on, the current events of the time. So to set the tone of the story, it said Roy landed in Washington the day that, or Roy landed the day that Hoover drove the veterans out of Washington. That is reference to an event called the Bonus March that took place here in the U.S. that they don't teach you about in school. Now, the Bonus March, the veterans of World War I fought during World War I. They fought and they came home and they were promised money in the form of bonuses, which was to be paid out in 1945. However, during the Great Depression in the 1930s, the veterans needed that money to survive. So they marched on Washington in an event called the Bonus March. It began here in Portland, Oregon, where I live, with a commander, Walter Waters. He and a band of veterans decided that they wanted to go to Washington to get their bonuses, so they hopped trains and traveled all the way from Portland, Oregon to Washington, D.C. to get their bonuses. And along their journey, they picked up momentum, and by the time they got to Washington, there were thousands of veterans there demanding their bonuses. And when they arrived there, and this was an integrated march on Washington in 1932. And when they arrived there, at first, the President Hoover, you know, the people were struggling, living in tents. He gave them water and supplies and things like that, because people were there with their wives and their children and their families, demanding these bonuses. And then after a few weeks, yes, a few weeks, demanding their bonus, President Hoover began to say that these were communists, Reds, and infiltrating, and they were traitors to the U.S. So he released the troops. He released U.S. troops and the police force to drive these veterans out of Washington, opened fire on U.S. citizens. Here in the U.S. troops opened fire on veterans who were demanding their bonuses for their participation in World War I. And Langston Hughes makes reference to that, and it sets the tone of the story that it's a very negative times in the U.S. And this was the time that Roy Williams decided to come home. So he saw the struggling in Europe, the struggling masses in Europe, and he come home and he see the struggling masses in the U.S. However, the 1% still enjoyed themselves and did not give a damn about anybody else. So we can see from Langston Hughes' description of what he saw through the character Roy Williams, because Langston Hughes traveled extensively all over the world. If you read his book, The Big C, and I Wonder As I Wonder, those are his two biographies. It talks about all the traveling that Langston Hughes had done in his life. They're two autobiographies, and they're very good books that you should read, and we are going to read through those books as these videos continue. So, socialism / communism is discussed in this book. What he's discussing here and what he is demonstrating is that the capitalist system in the U.S. was not working. The system in Europe was not working, and the system that we have set up, you have few who are so rich that they'll never be affected by anything going on in the U.S., and then you have the poor who are affected by everything that goes on in the U.S. And just to add on to that, my personal experience, I spoke to my grandmother about the Great Depression. We had a project when I was in school, and our teachers wanted us to go home and ask our grandparents about what happened during the Great Depression. So I'm a little bit older than what many of you may believe, but I spoke to my grandmother about the Great Depression, and my grandmother said, Jason, we were black folks living in Southern Ohio. We didn't have anything to begin with before the Great Depression, and we didn't have anything after the Great Depression. She said, I can sit here and tell you about my life during the Great Depression, but we weren't affected by the Great Depression because we didn't have anything to begin with before the Depression and during the Depression and a little bit after the Depression. Langston Hughes talks about and makes reference to the Great Depression, but and we'll see in his stories that take place in the 1920s as well, where black people didn't have anything. It wasn't like black people started losing millions of dollars during the Great Depression, because they were struggling before the Great Depression and they're struggling after the Great Depression. And here in 2017, the majority of black people are struggling now. So now the other topic that I want to get into is Langston Hughes' discussion of the arts. As a poet and the people that he ran with, Wallace Thurman, Zora Neale Hurston, and Countee Cullen, and others, the other artists during that period, they were very interested in the arts. And it is demonstrated in this book that Langston Hughes had an extensive knowledge of music, and Roy Williams, a black violinist, which reminds me that nowadays you don't see too many black violinists, but back in the day, black people played instruments, and it shouldn't be a rare thing for us to see a black man playing a violin, because if we think about in the days of slavery, the fiddlers, like a fiddle is basically the same thing as a violin. The fiddlers were black Americans, black slaves. So somewhere along the line, we stopped playing instruments, and now it's very rare that we see a black violinist. But in this story, he talks about a black violinist, and again, at that time period, it was rare as well. From what we read about some comments that Roy Williams states during a session called the Stream of Consciousness, which Langston Hughes liked to use very much in his writings. Now, stream of consciousness is something that you only get in literature. You can't get it anywhere else. You can't get it in movies. You can't get it in history books. You can't get it in encyclopedias. You can read about what it is. But stream of consciousness only happens in literature. And this is just a stream of thoughts going through a character during a particular point in time. So I'm going to read to you some sections of streams of consciousness that Roy Williams has as he's a violinist standing up to play in front of his church. And again, there's a discussion of economics in his church where it's a place of worship where you would think that racism and everything shouldn't enter. However, it does enter. The white people want to see Roy play, and they pay a little bit more money so they can sit in the good seats. And the black people who can't pay as much as the white folks have to sit in the back of their own church to watch one of their own play based on politics and economics. The politics is the segregation, and the economics is the cost of the seats, which is like 25 cents for the poor seats and 50 cents for the good seats in the church. Okay, so Roy Williams and his stream of consciousness. Okay, so we are going to turn to page 40. Okay. This, my friends, I should say, ladies and gentlemen, there are white folks in the audience who are not my friends. This is a meditation from Thais by Massenet. This is the broken heart of a dream come true, not true. This is music and me sitting on the doorstep of the world, needing you. O body of life and love with black hands and brown limbs and white breasts and a golden face with lips like a violin bowed for singing. Steady, Roy. It's hot in this crowded church, and you're sick as hell. This, the dream and the dreamer, wandering in the desert from Hopkinsville to Vienna in love with a streetwalker named Music. Listen, you bitch. I want you to be beautiful as the moon in the night on the edge of the Missouri hills. I'll make you beautiful. The meditation from Thais. You remember, Ma? Even to hear me play, you've got your seat in the amen corner tonight, like on Sunday mornings when you come to talk to God. You remember that Chrysler record we had on the phonograph with the big horn when I was a kid? Nobody liked it but me, but you didn't care how many times I played it over and over. Where'd you get my violin? Half the time you didn't have the money to pay old man Miller for my lesson every week. God rest his unpaid soul, as the Catholics say. Why did you cry, Ma, when I went away with the minstrel stroll, playing coon songs through the South instead of hymns? Why did you cry, Ma, when I wrote you I had a job with the night jazz band on State Street in Chicago? Okay, and I'm going to skip. This is Hopkinsville, Missouri. Look at all those brown girls back there in the crowd of Negroes leaning towards me and the music. First time most of them ever saw a man in evening clothes, black or white. First time most of them ever heard the meditation from Thai. First time they ever heard one of their own race coming home from abroad playing a violin. See them looking proud at me and music over the head of the white folks in the first rows, over the head of the white woman in the cheap coat and red hat who knows what music's all about. Who are you, lady? Now we know that that lady in the red coat is the Miss Reese who stopped Roy Williams later on that week in the evening and resulted in his lynching. But that was a stream of consciousness which you can't get anywhere except literature. And Langston Hughes uses it a lot in his writing. And it shows you the emotions, the feelings, and everything that's going on with a character at a particular period in time. And you can see here that Roy Williams was suffering from his sickness. He's performing in front of people who he says are not his friends. The white people, he said, because there are some of you here who are not my friends. And he illustrates to us that the black people seeing him playing during that period in time had never seen anything like that. So he was, he was a benefit to his race, and he was doing it even though he was sick. He felt that he had something that he had to do. He had a gift, and he was giving back to his community. This is Jason Williams, Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.